This is the word of the Lord. That a person was crucified on the hill outside of the city of Jerusalem was, of course, by no means a unique occurrence in the time of Jesus. This kind of brutality was very common. It was a deliberate deterrent by the Romans. Mess with the authorities, this is what you get. The crucifixion of Jesus was not extraordinary. Even the fact that Jesus was innocent of the crimes for which he was executed was by no means unique. Many were wrongly accused, went through bogus trials, and ended up hung on a cross for no good reason. But the bit that happened next made the story of Jesus quite unique. Let's set the scene. After the tragic events of the Thursday evening and into Friday, Jesus had died on a cross on the eve of the Sabbath. And in such a situation, the body of the deceased person would be hastily put into usually an unmarked grave without all the due care that would normally take place at burial. See, the Jews did not like to leave the bodies out exposed in the open over the Sabbath. They had respect for human life, and it showed in their respect for the bodies of the dead as well. So these women had celebrated the rest day on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, and then went to the tomb to finish the burial task. Mark's Gospel adds the little detail that the women bought spices that they might anoint the body. This was a common practice for burial in those days. And all of this is exactly as we should normally expect to happen in a situation of a death on the eve of a Sabbath. Now, I just want to do a little sidebar here for a moment. Culture creates patterns of behaviour that have been identified as helpful so that we don't have to reinvent what we do every time we meet a particular situation. This is kind of human development 101. We learn from each other and we learn from what happened last time. Our best learning, whatever has proven to be most helpful, begins to be repeated. These learnings then become patterns, and this is how culture naturally forms. It's not arbitrary or random. Culture becomes culture for very good reasons. It has been cultivated, where we get culture from. And the culture then cultivates us, who are raised in that culture. One of the most basic things culture offers to us is a sense of order and purpose. There are many moments and experiences in life that mess with our sense of well-being, and perhaps death is one of the most powerful of these. We experience death as a loss. Someone close to us has gone. Our ongoing experience of our own life will be forever changed by losing someone close to us. Helpful culture will seek to enact a narrative and ritual around this inevitable event to guide us through the process of our grief. To be perfectly honest, we're not half so good at it these days as they were in Jesus' day. You know, our culture does everything it can to avoid facing the reality of death. We prefer to make a person's life a living death through never-ending medical interventions that neither restore health nor allow for rest in peace. That's how bad we are at it. But we've become so clever at this that our medical technology has developed so far that we're now wrestling with questions related not only simply to when should we allow a person to die, but do they have the right under certain unenviable circumstances to ask to have their life taken from them? These are deep, heartfelt and vexing questions. And they're made the more distressing, I think, because we are so unaccepting of death as an inevitable and vital element of our life. So our culture is awkward with death. In Jesus' day, when there was a death, the whole community gathered. Women who were actually schooled in wailing, that was their skill. They wailed. They would come along and they would wail because they would help people access the grief that was inevitably there. And the more efficiently you accessed your grief, the more efficiently you could progress that process of coming to terms and letting go. We glimpsed some of this in the story of Lazarus a few weeks ago that we read. So these women, they're going to the tomb where Jesus' dead body was laid to rest. They will complete the culturally established rituals associated with the burial of a loved one. Only we know the story does not proceed as normally expected. The earth quakes, a kind of portent to the earth-shaking turn this story is about to take. The women go to the tomb. With the earthquake, it seems that the large stone that functioned as a seal for the tomb had been moved from its position over the opening. If we're to believe the way it is told here in Matthew's Gospel, the Roman soldiers who'd been ordered to stand guard to ensure the tomb was not interfered with had experienced some kind of traumatic shock. The apparent cause of the shock reaction of these soldiers was the inexplicable appearance of an angel of the Lord. Now, how did they know this person was an angel of the Lord? The being was not merely bright-eyed. Apparently, he appeared like lightning. So think about that for a moment. After the steady light of the sun, lightning is probably the brightest thing we see in our natural world, and it sort of flashes and it's there and gone. It leaves marks in your eyes if you see it when it happens. It's kind of a bit overwhelming. Our modern day minds may prefer to find explanations for these things that are closer to the experience of life we have known, an explanation that, put simply, we find easier to believe. And at that moment, we do well to pause. What is it that makes something easier to believe? Isn't it simply that we have known it to happen like that previously? So it's just a bit easier to believe that it would happen like that again. The hardest things to believe are those things that are without precedent. Did that really happen? See, human beings are not merely accustomed to observing patterns that repeat. Our sense of well-being is built on these patterns. From the earliest days, the explorers left familiar territory and roamed beyond their horizon, using the patterns of the stars in the night sky to orient themselves. We orient ourselves with patterns. The entirety of the enterprise we today know as science is built upon the observation of patterns that can be relied upon to repeat, and as a consequence, we can learn what they are. Each time Elon Musk's SpaceX company blows up another prototype rocket, the technicians and the scientists discover something new, a pattern they had not previously realized. So they adjust their design or their process precisely because they know if it did that last time and all things were equal and the same, it'll do it again next time. It's a pattern, right? And we look for patterns in human behaviour. Pollsters and political operatives, they look for patterns in the electorate. What's the electorate doing? Business people look for patterns in the market. There's a lot of hype around at the moment about AI and ChatGPT. Have you heard about that? And it seems to me that this is really about very, very powerful computers getting masses and masses of data and distilling the patterns, working out what are the patterns of speech and behaviour, and using this machine learning to predict what will be the next word in the sentence, or the next sentence in the paragraph, or the next paragraph in the chapter. This most amazing of Wizard of Oz scale machines is simply reflecting back to us our well-established patterns. Learning the patterns is how we navigate our way through life. The particular patterns we decide to focus on reveal what we believe is most important to us, because we simply can't learn all the patterns. There's too many. We've got to choose, and our choices shine light on what we believe far more penetrating than do our declared beliefs. And the point here is The normal anticipated pattern is broken. We can't anticipate an earthquake. Soldiers should not be quaking in trauma while guarding a tomb. Persons do not appear like lightning. And the dead most assuredly stay dead, right? Little wonder the women left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to report it to the disciples. We can only guess at what, if any, conversation passed between these women as they ran. Did you see what I saw? Did that guy really say that thing that he said? And I imagine that just as they were deciding that it was all something they had eaten the night before, they had an encounter with the risen Jesus. Jesus greets them. They fall at his feet in respect and worship, and they take hold of him, take hold of his feet. All the patterns they had learnt in this moment were falling away. And the reality is there's nothing more frightening than not knowing what the hell is going on. The possibilities that flood in to fill the void can be overwhelming. We have to make meaning. We have to work out what's going on. And without reliable data, our attempts to grapple and understand can gain no traction. It's as if, for a moment at least, normal has been suspended and anything might happen next. I put it to you, that is pretty frightening. The artwork of the surrealists give an artistic expression to this experience. Elements are depicted with largely realistic detail, but not in their normal or expected configuration. I don't do this so often these days, but this is a Salvador Dali painting, The Persistence of Memory. It depicts these flaccid, melted pocket watches. Quite interesting there. One's drooped larger than life over what looks to be a dead tree, and there's a few others there. I think there's another one down there that's got little bubbly things on it. The tree is obvious, right? You can see a tree there, and there's at least 4 pocket watches, 3 of them quite melted. The other one got other interesting things on it. The pattern of relationship and behaviour that we would normally expect of and between these elements has been disrupted. The surrealist artist does this to indicate that there is new meaning to be made here. He wants to say something, and I wouldn't dare guess at what Dali is saying there, but he's wanting to say something. I want to suggest to you that resurrection functions in a similar, yet far more all-embracing way. I'll take that back so it doesn't distract you. See, the gospel accounts of the new week, 3 days after Jesus' death, have a kind of surrealist effect on us. That is to say, it's straightforward enough to recognise each of the elements depicted in this story. They're just not arranged or behaving according to the normal pattern, the way that they should, or we are used to them behaving. We understand someone sitting on a stone, that's not too difficult. We understand the flashing brightness of lightning, we've all seen that. We just don't put those two things into the same element. We understand soldiers. We understand fainting with fear. We just don't generally put them together in that way. Our senses are jarred, and we could react, just as many do with surrealist artwork, by dismissing this as stupid and nonsensical. We can hold fast to the patterns with which we are already familiar and simply rule out anything that does not conform to the way we have learnt to see and understand. But we would thereby be missing out. The Gospels want to tell us that there is yet more meaning to be found here, more than you currently know, more than you have yet imagined. For the women in this story, and let's again pause for a moment and recognise the fact that they are women, because that's an important feature. If you were writing propaganda, trying to convince people or manipulate them in some way, you would not use women as your primary witness, because in first century Palestine, women were not regarded as reliable witnesses. Their testimony was simply not admissible in court. They were quite vulnerable to intimidation. And as Jen Brewer taught me on Friday, I'd never heard this before, and it makes so much sense. They were ruled out of giving testimony because that would have put their lives at risk if men wanted to intimidate them. It was for their protection. So for these women, the utterly discombobulating scene they just encountered could easily have been dismissed as a kind of waking dream. No one was likely to believe them at any rate. It would have been the easiest thing of all to just let this strange morning fade into the background of their memory. That is, until they had an encounter with someone they could not forget nor explain away. They encountered their friend, the risen Jesus. This kind of experience is far more definitive. We do not suffer uncertainty regarding the people we know well. Now they could not forget what they'd seen, nor pretend that it had never happened. And so they have a choice. They were told to go to the gathered disciples and then tell the disciples what the angel had said. And then the disciples had a choice. Should they stay or should they go now? Should they stay where they were, or should they travel to Galilee, as the women reported, as telling them the angel told them to do? Had the disciples decided at that point to attempt to reason their way forward, they would have inevitably fallen back on the patterns they had known so far. Angels don't generally visit, soldiers don't faint with fear, the dead do not rise. That would have been the reasonable response. Instead, perhaps out of merely grief or the need to hold on to some sliver of hope, they do decide to go to Galilee, and there they have their own first-hand encounter with the risen Jesus, just as Jesus had indicated that they would. But see, the thing is, you can't understand the resurrection. You might reflect on it. You could talk about it. You could even speculate on various details associated with it. But in the end, you have to experience it. We have to decide to leave behind the parameters we have held to that disallow the possibility of such a thing, and we entrust ourselves to this possibility. And when we do so, we discover life makes sense in a whole new way. The larger story we believe ourselves to be caught up in always shapes the way we make sense of things. As we approach Anzac Day, I'm reminded that soldiers in a war shoot to kill soldiers in the opposing army, people who they have never met and between whom there is no personal quarrel. They can be moved to this most extreme behaviour by a larger story into which they have been caught up. In the absence of war, the larger story into which we become caught up these days is most generally an economic one. We have lost sight of what anything is worth, and we can only tell each other how much everything costs. Yet this also has become a sleight of hand, because economy has become a stand-in for survival. Accumulate as much as you can in order to be as comfortable and secure as possible. But for what? Like Jesus' story of the man who filled his barns and then tore them down and built bigger barns and then intended to sit back and enjoy his rest, but that very night he died. And what was it all for then? If we do not learn to live before we die, we are foolish to believe we might learn when it is all over and done. When we entrust ourselves to the largest of all stories, the story of resurrection, we discover more meaning than we could hope to contain in one lifetime. We burst forth in life so rich that it challenges the established patterns of this world culture and offers an alternative to the existence this world cultivates. Reading it in a story will point us in the right direction, but we only know the life-giving power as we live it. Anything short of that is merely academic, and it's not particularly reasonable academics either. Many of us have known the story of Jesus' resurrection for a long time. It's shaped and formed us through various parts of our life. And as we go on, the story can become less and less compelling if it remains merely a story to us. The patterns of the realities of our life, as we've made decisions each day, come to so dominate our perspective that we relegate any notion of resurrection to a kind of secondary status. We might see it as anything from an interesting thing to be explored later, sometime, or perhaps even merely a children's fairy tale. However, if each day we entrust ourselves to Jesus and live into the uniquely life-giving power of his resurrection, the power that transforms even that which was once dead, then each day we will experience genuine miracles. We will see relationships transformed. We can be instrumental in bringing new hope to those who'd lost their reason to keep going. We can be in our communities in ways that bring people together. We can foster forgiveness and reconciliation. We can speak truth in love and demonstrate faithfulness regardless of the cost. These sustained miracles are fueled by Jesus' resurrection power. They are steps of faith that testify to Jesus' resurrection power. As we live them, it will no longer be merely a story. We will know the truth and power of Jesus' resurrection. We will not stay with the standard patterns of this world's culture. We will allow them to be disrupted and suspended, and to go instead with the risen Christ. For Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. Amen.